second thing we need to do today in order to be able to describe the United States government is we need to be able to compare it to other governments a little bit. So we'll dive into comparative politics just a little bit. We're going to look at 3 different ways to classify governments. So we're going to start with some real simple stuff: who controls the government. Then we're going to look at their control of territory, which is going to be more important to the United States. And finally, we'll look at parliamentary and presidential elections. So first, let's look at some real basic who has control of the government. And you guys should recognize these first 3 terms here: democracy, autocracy, and oligarchy. Democracy, if I asked you what it means, you would tell me the people have the power. That's excellent. Autocracy, we probably think of this as like a dictatorship or a monarchy or something like that, but this is ruled by one person, or one person with most of the political power. And oligarchy would be ruled by a small group, usually like a group of elites or something like that. So those are all real basic. I think you guys are also familiar with most of the second set of terms here. These are some that we'll throw around a little bit, comparing the United States to other countries. So a theocracy obviously would be a state where the government is run by religious leaders. Think of something like Iran, which has its religious leaders serve in positions of power. Aristocracy would be an older form of government where most of the landowners have the power. So we won't see too much of that anymore, but we'll talk about it from time to time. A technocracy would be a government ruled by trained experts. So we won't spend a lot of time talking about this, but we could see this in places like modern China, where they have like a very expansive government system. They find the people that are best at specific jobs, and those people rise in power and things like that. And then similar would be a meritocracy, where we find the people with the best ability and put them in charge of things. So more importantly, we want to look at how states control their territory. And so we have these 3 different levels. We have unitary, we have confederation, and then a combination of those 2, we have a federal government. And that's how we're going to describe the United States. A unitary government just means that there's one level of government. It would be one central government that has all of the power in a state. They would control all of the territory from one centralized place, and all the power would kind of be top down. The opposite end of that would be a confederation. And you guys remember from U.S. history, this was the first system of government for the colonies. So what we had there we had 13 small, pretty local governments, and they worked together loosely on a couple of things, like a little bit of economic cooperation and military planning. But other than that, those were basically 13 separate countries. And ultimately, we'll get into later, we'll learn the reasons why that didn't work for us. But confederations, we might see some similar things like that in the world today. But right there in the middle is the one we want to focus on. This is a federal government. And what that does is that combines both of these plans. It takes the group of small local governments and adds a central government to it. So you have one big central government that shares powers with smaller local governments. And so we're going to spend a lot of time getting into federalism, but one of the things it does best is it allows for some flexibility from place to place, and it's a really good way to give the people what's best for them in a state with an enormous territory like the United States or Canada. We'll look real quick at just a couple of examples here. On the unitary government, this is going to work best in like small states, small nation states. We still have a few of those. If we want to think of something like France, it's geographically small. Most of the region is similar and all that. So all they need is a central government to get things done. A federal government's going to be better off, especially in a state with a large territory. My examples there: Russia, Canada, and the United States. Those are the 3 largest countries in the world in terms of space. So all 3 of them have found that a combination of central planning and local control is best to meet the needs of the people and simultaneously cooperate or work together on a large global scale. And then finally we have confederation, and this is more of an early form of government. We really don't have a lot of these anymore, but you could look at something like the European Union today as a form of a confederation. And once we get past the colonies in this first couple weeks here, we won't spend a lot more time talking about that. The last thing we want to talk about is the difference between a presidential and a parliamentary government. So a presidential government is obviously what we have here in the United States. The main difference between that and a parliamentary government is who the people have control over directly. So as you see on the left, the presidential government, like here in the United States, the voters get to choose the legislative branch and the executive branch. We choose those separately. When we go vote in November, you're going to not only vote for your choice of president, so you're voting for who you want to run the executive branch, but you're also separately going to vote for your representative to the House of Representatives and for your representative in the Senate. So you're choosing the legislative branch and the executive branch separately. In a parliamentary government, when the voters go to vote, all they vote on is their member of parliament or their representative to the legislative branch. So then the legislative branch gets together, and among its members, they choose the executive branch. So all of the representatives win their elections to the legislative branch. When they meet together in a group, that's when the legislators will choose from among themselves a person to serve as the head of the executive branch. Usually we'll call this person a prime minister. But a prime minister was elected by the members of Congress or Parliament instead of by the particular voters. So since the voters have different levels of control over these branches, these two forms of government work differently. Let's look at the parliamentary government first. Since the legislators are the ones that choose the executive, they're also the ones that can get rid of the executive. So the executive is more likely to do what the legislators want him to do. The legislators chose that person to carry out the ideas that they all already agree on together. So if you had a legislative branch that was made up of mostly Democrats and very few Republicans, they would obviously choose a Democrat to be their executive, and then the legislative branch and the executive branch would work together. So what happens is you have policies that are passed quickly. They respond very quickly to problems, but the policies can change drastically from one administration to another. This government's going to be working together. It's going to pass lots of policy. Meanwhile, on the presidential side, since the voters choose those two branches separately, we're often going to end up with results where one group controls the legislative branch and another group controls the executive branch. Like right now in the United States, President Trump is a Republican president, but part of Congress is controlled by Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats in the House of Representatives. So in order for policies to get passed, we're going to have to see compromise from those two groups. So what happens in a presidential government is that the policies are made much slower. There's a lot more compromise involved, and there's a lot more places for conflict to happen. So sometimes there's a crisis and no solution comes out of it. We might be seeing a little of that right now, where Republicans and Democrats don't agree on the best ways to solve the coronavirus and to boost the economy during this crisis. So on paper, you might look at these and think that a presidential government is way worse than a parliamentary government, and it's easy to see why you would feel that way. One of the things I like to say about this is that a parliamentary government will make you very, very happy some of the time when the group in power has your same political priorities. You're going to be very pleased with what the government's doing because they're consistently going to be passing policies that you like. This is great. I'm so happy about what the government's doing. A problem comes along, they're going to solve it real quick, and you're satisfied. However, sometimes the group that you disagree with is going to be in political power, and they're going to have the same amount of power. They're going to pass the same amount of policies. So you're probably going to be very angry half the time, right? Sometimes in the parliamentary system, things will be very, very great, but other times in the parliamentary system, things will be awful, and you'll be so mad because the other group in power is just ruining the government the way you see things. Over on the presidential side, it's going to be frustrating when the government can't come together and find solutions to problems quickly. It's going to be frustrating when problems in the United States, like continued economic downturn or something like the number of mass shootings that have occurred in this country over several years now, don't really get addressed appropriately by the executive branch and the legislative branch. So it's frustrating. At the same time, you're a little bit frustrated instead of sometimes very, very angry at the government. So each side has their pros and cons, right? The parliamentary government's going to make you real happy sometimes, but real upset other times. The United States, or a presidential system, is never going to make you super happy, and it's never going to make you super sad. You're kind of always going to be in that Goldilocks zone right in the middle. So that's another way that we want to think about the differences in these systems here. And finally, a thing that we have to understand here is the difference between a direct democracy and a representative democracy, or what we can call a republic. In the United States, we often say that the United States is a democracy and all that, but actually the United States would be a republic. In a direct democracy, the voters are going to have all the power. The voters are going to have direct power over policy. So the public, would vote on not just leadership and stuff like that, but they'd vote on every decision. And that's not realistic. In a country this big, in a country with 330 million people, we can't have an election every day to run down the 50 different policy decisions that the government's going to make. We do have some instances of direct democracy at the local level. We call these referendums. Those of you guys that are voting this year, you'll end up voting on a referendum about where police can live or something like that. In Tennessee in the last few years, we let the voters decide whether or not people wanted to be able to buy wine in the grocery store. So in that case, you have voters making a direct policy decision about the policies that will be in place. But on the national level, we don't do that. The United States, all we have is the representative democracy. As voters, we choose people that are going to make decisions for us. So we have control over who the government is, but we don't have total control over what the government does. We're going to have to find ways to hold those representatives accountable, usually by frequent elections or different ways to get them out of office or to reward them and things like that. But the voters don't have direct control over the policies that get made. The other characteristic of this type of government is, since we're getting together and we're choosing people to make those decisions for us, those candidates have to appeal to the most voters possible. And so what usually happens in a situation like that is that the representatives end up being a lot more moderate than the voters themselves are. So they're a little more willing to compromise. They're a little less likely to make drastic changes. So that's just a real simple breakdown of some different forms of government that we'll be dealing with, especially early here. So, make sure that you've got some idea, especially in the differences between the unitary and federal governments, and especially in the differences between the presidential and parliamentary government.